All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Journey Through the Author Bank seminar. I'm so excited to have you all here on this Thursday evening. So as we get started, feel free to put in the chat where you're joining us from. I am joining from outside of our offices in Annapolis, Maryland, so I'm in the greater DC area. We're having some really nice weather, which is enjoyable after we spiked right up to 80 and had no spring. So we're back to spring. Oh, Colorado, how nice. I bet your weather is maybe snowing, maybe not. I can never tell with Colorado. So it's so great to have y'all join us. And as you probably know, today we're talking about Beowulf. And I would love to hear from y'all in the chat as well, whether you've ever read Beowulf, whether you've heard about it, maybe read some passages, or whether it's completely alien to you and you're just here to learn more. I'm really excited for us to get this conversation going. So wait a couple more minutes for more people to trickle in. So at this point, I am so excited to welcome you all to our journey through the author bank. And so many of you might be wondering, why does CLT do this? You know, you're a testing company. Why are you doing webinars or presentations? And that's because we are just so passionate about introducing you to the greater sort of Western great books tradition that Beowulf is a part of. So for those of you who are familiar with our tests, you know that we pull from some of the greatest thinkers ever. So Aristotle, Aquinas, Cicero, and we have some anonymous authors like the one of Beowulf in our tests as well. And we just want to introduce you to things that are good and true and beautiful, and that will improve you as a person and a scholar, because you know a test can only do so much. So we want to improve you as a person as well. And so it is my absolute pleasure to introduce y'all to Dr. Esolen, who will be giving us our webinar tonight on Beowulf. Dr. Esolen, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for joining. When I thought about the lecture today, I assumed that everybody had read Beowulf, but for those of you who have not, I'll try to give a little bit of the plot that the others will have been aware of already. We've got a very interesting work of literature here, a fascinating work. Now, if we were talking about this maybe 100 years ago, 120 years ago, everybody would assume that, I mean, all the cool kids at that time would have assumed that Beowulf, the poem that we have, survived in one manuscript, was sort of cobbled together by a couple of different authors, namely a really vigorous and intelligent pagan author, and then some moralistic Christian author who plunked in a few things about religious faith here and there. Nobody believes that anymore. Okay, that point of view has been exploded. And J.R.R. Tolkien, of happy memory, was perhaps the most famous person and the most important person to explode it and to say, no, we need to read this poem for what it is. It's a coherent and intricately composed single work. Okay, whether it had a little editorial touch here and there, as Tolkien believed, is secondary to what we've got before us. We've got a coherent poem. And it's a fascinating one, too, because it is deliberately set on the cusp of the evangelization of the Angles and the Saxons. Okay, this poem is quite consciously intended by the poet to be occupying that fault line between the pagan past and what he himself would have experienced as a new way of life. Okay, the evangel, the gospel, having finally come to German tribes, but not to all of them. To his, but by no means to all of them. After all, the Vikings themselves will not be evangelized for another several hundred years after this poem is written. And even as the poem is being written, I will say roughly in the early 700s. All you had to do was cross the North Sea into Frisia, and there they were living according to the old pagan Germanic warrior ethos. Okay, they had not yet been evangelized. So we got a really interesting situation here. Our poet is a Christian monk, right? They are the ones who wrote. He is not doing either of two things that we might expect. One is look back upon the pagan past and say, well, what the heck do all of these stories have to do with Christ? They don't have anything to do with Christ, so why bother? All right. He's not doing that. And he's not also saying, hey, you know what? We had some pretty good things going on in that their pagan past, and it was not so bad after all, and sugarcoating it. And he's not doing that either. Okay, what he's got is a really problematic and hard and honest look, brutally honest look at the way of life of his own people, right? Maybe his grandparents, maybe his parents converted as adults, okay? Certainly his distant cousins in other tribes, not near where he's living, but right across the sea, would be living according to these rules that we see set down here. What about that? What about that past, which is my own past, the past of my own people? What about it? What do I make of it? Okay. I don't condemn it. I don't sugarcoat it. And I don't make a compromise between those two. I want as honest a look at it as possible. And to that end, he gives us a very strange thing. He gives us not just the best that that world had to offer, but a sort of imaginary world where the people are becoming conscious that their way of life has no hope to it, leads to an impasse. There's no solution from within that they can apply to make the situation better. Okay. They're at the end of the line and they're becoming aware of it. Okay. Um, to try to give you some way to understand this, right? This is a work that you would say, well, how could it be historical? There's a bunch of monsters in it. There's a dragon. There's a giant Grendel. Grendel's mother who lives in a cave at the bottom of a swamp. This is all fanciful stuff. Grendel with the might of 30 men. Grendel eats 30 men. Grabs them all up. I mean, this is just northern Viking-like monsters. But no, most of the characters that are named in this poem are historical figures. Okay, Rothgar is a historical figure. The Danish king whose hall is beset by this monster Grendel during the night, not during the day, but during the night. And then, well, put it this way, most Danish warriors find some farther away place to sleep at night, the poet says. They'd rather not sleep in that hall there. Hrothgar is a historical person, and so is our hero Beowulf's lord, Hygelac, right? Hygelac, the Beowulf's king, king of the Geats, he is a historical figure. He will die. We know when he dies. He dies in the year 521 because he does the typical thing that is praised at the beginning of this poem. How do you define a good king? We'll see it in a moment. You define a good king because he beats up on his neighbors, who are usually enemies, and sometimes, they're enemies because you've beat up on them. Sometimes you beat up on them because you're your enemies, and sometimes you can't tell which came first. He beats up on his enemies and he takes their things. And the poet says, I think deeply ironically, that was God Kuning. That was a good king. Okay. Well, Hygelac engages in a raid on Frisia, right? Because that's the sort of thing that kings do. And it's a disaster. He dies, and his people are slaughtered. That's the key political event in this poem, and it's a historical event, right? Beowulf himself, our hero, is the one figure who's not historical. He stands in the poem and somehow outside of it, in that pagan world, and yet there's something about him that suggests a world that is not pagan anymore. Okay, um, he's such a person as could not have existed. That is to say, a person who is sort of semi-evangelized, um, without ever having heard of any gospel or anything about God, other than the very little that all these people in the poem seem to be aware of. The first, say, 10 or 11 chapters of Genesis, up to Noah's flood and the destruction of the Tower of Babel, those things. Okay, now such pagans didn't actually exist anywhere, but our poet imagines them to exist. He even gives these beliefs to historical figures like Rothgar, to give us a kind of pagan world that is desperately trying not to be pagan anymore, but has no resources within itself. Okay, um, it's kind of a historical situation, right? A man whose own people have recently changed their way of life, looking back upon a way of life of his forebears and trying to come to terms with it, and knowing that that's the same way of life that is led by his ethnic cousins uh, across the North Sea on the continent, across the North Sea and up into the Baltic Sea. If we go towards Scandinavia, all right. And what do we do? What do we make of our own past? Right? It's a crucial question. The poem seems to begin straightforwardly enough, but I think right from the beginning, we should be aware that we're in the presence of a master poet whose irony is very subtle, but also ubiquitous. It's everywhere to be found, right? And by the way, I'm going to read a little bit in Old English once or twice here tonight, so that after this, you will never say again that Charles Dickens wrote in Old English or that William Shakespeare wrote in Old English. Shakespeare wrote in modern English, right? This is what Old English sounds like. What we gardena in jærdagum theud kunninga thrimjefrunon huda erlinges eln fremedon. That's Old English. Listen up. We have heard of the glory of the Spear Danes in the old days, the kings of tribes, how noble princes showed great courage. Okay. And the first king that's mentioned here is an historical figure, Skuld Skeving. Oft Skuld Skeving Shavana Thratna, Money of Mag, Meadow Settler, Oftach. Often Skuld Skeving seized mead benches from enemy troops from many a clan. Going on a bit. He terrified warriors, even though first he was found a waif, helpless. For that came a remedy. He grew under heaven, prospered in honors, till every last one of his neighboring peoples over the road of the whales had to heed him, had to pay him gold, had to pay him tribute. Basically, all your neighbors around are scared of you because you have raided them. And when you raid, I mean, it's, half the time you're herding cattle or farming, the other half the time you go on pillaging rampages, usually by water. And the poet sums it all up by saying that was God fearing. That was a good king. Later on in the poem, those words will be applied to Hrothgar, a very different kind of person, and yet still stuck in that same old way of life. That was a good king. I think the poet is setting us up. He's saying this is what the definition of a good king was, and I don't mean to denigrate it. As far as it goes, it is something somehow impressive. It requires courage, after all, And the good king will give generously to the warriors who have supported him. Well, he can afford to give generously because he gives from the plunder. Okay, but this is the definition of a good king. And the poem begins with this Scyld having recently died, and the uh, the uh, the chieftains, the elders of his people, set his body on a ship, and they load that ship with a lot of the treasure that he won, and they send it out to sea, right? Um, and nobody knows. Uh, this is rather ominous, and again, this is a sort of Germanic, ironic understatement. Men cannot say, wise men in hall, nor warriors in the field, not truly, who received that cargo. Send him out to sea, but they don't know where he's going. And of course, the implications are we're Christians, we're reading this. This is the poem of a Christian monk. What's the eternal destination of this children? The poet doesn't say. What the poet says is that nobody could say. All right. They are, in other words, in a kind of um, deep gloom. Right. They they are given some light by a sort of natural revelation, and as I said, they seem to be somehow mysteriously aware of the first few chapters of Genesis, but otherwise they don't have the light. And they can't tell. There are certain things that they simply cannot know. They do not know. It's a deep mystery to them. All right. The reason why I bring up this boat funeral at the beginning, and by the way, we have archaeological evidence to prove that there were such things. Okay, this is not just fancy. The poet has constructed the poem in what's called a chiastic fashion. That is, it's divided up into sections called fits, F-I-T-T, and there are 43 of them, and many of them are arranged in a sort of mirror, an X shape. And this is perhaps the strongest of them all. This first fit about the sea burial of Scyld Scefing is mirrored by the final fit, which is the funeral of Beowulf. Beowulf is not set forth on a ship. He is burned on a funeral pyre with the treasure that he has won from the dragon. He defeated the dragon with help of his only loyal thane at the time, but he received his death wound there, a mortal wound, and his people are saying goodbye to him in tremendous sorrow and gloom. I'll get to that in a moment. They, however, don't float him out to sea. They burn him on a pyre, and the poet says, "Heaven swallowed the smoke." And it's what it means literally, and we are left with a great big question mark. Surely Beowulf's destination is not the same as that of Scyld Scefing, but the poet doesn't actually say what the destination is. Heaven swallowed the what? Heaven accepted his soul, and heaven swallowed the smoke. The skies swallowed the smoke. He deliberately leaves us with that question. Okay, because if there was anybody in this world, whether we think of it as historical world or the imaginary figures that are placed into this historical world, Beowulf is the best of them, and of the best of them, he can only give us a rather ambiguous affirmation about his eternal destiny. Okay, there are a couple of big moral problems that beset everybody in this poem. Okay, and they have centrally to do with the pagan Germanic way of life. Right. First is uh, this is this this is a world filled with hatreds and vengeance. In other words, it's a typically human world, right? We don't have to go to Germany to find that. You can go anywhere in the world and find that. Okay. Um, in this world, though, in this particular culture, you are to hold as sacred the relations of kinship. Okay, um, you would typically be some kind of distant cousin, at least, to your lord. Your lord is not living in a capital city or someplace like. There are no cities, no capitals like that. He's your chieftain. He's your warlord, right? You're related to him in some way. You're related to everybody in some way. And so, this being the case, to kill someone who is a kinsman of yours is one of the is maybe perhaps the greatest sin of all, right? And yet, well, we know what human beings are like, why Rome itself, as the poet was quite aware, was founded on a fratricide. St. Augustine pointed that out in the City of God. And fratricides, the killing of a brother or the killing of a cousin, they're all over the place in this work, right? So, for instance, Beowulf, uh, Beowulf, our hero, learns that a monster Grendel has besieged the hall of the Danish king Rothgar and is causing him no end of trouble. Has preyed upon, literally eaten what men of Hrothgar's he could find in the hall at night. It's all sorrow there because Rothgar the king is not capable of defeating Grendel. He's an old man, and his warrior Danes are scared to death of Grendel. They won't go near it. Beowulf hears about it. He's a young man. He's full of vibrancy and confidence. He sails forth from his country across the straits, the Baltic Sea, to Denmark to help Hrothgar. Okay. When Hrothgar hears this, he says, I know you. I saw you when you were a little boy. I knew your father. Your father, Ecgtheow. In fact, he was a friend of mine because Ecgtheow, Beowulf's father, had to flee from his own land because he had killed a kinsman. And in those days, you would flee, and you'd flee to somewhere else for protection. And then, a warlord would say, okay, listen, you be a loyal man of mine. I'll give you protection here, and I'll pay some money. It's actually a name for the money. I'll pay some money to get the Avengers off your back. It was called Weregild, literally man money. Okay, and we know this. We know this was the case. This is talked about all over the place. It's the Icelandic history into the 12th century. Is just filled with examples of kinsmen killing each other, rivals killing each other, and then the families demanding livestock, land, and gold in compensation. Okay. One of the typical things that you did in Iceland at the yearly meeting for, the common good was to decide who had to pay whom how much for having killed his brother or his nephew or someone like that. Turns out that Ecgtheow had to flee, and Hrothgar gave him protection. And he says, "You look like your father." This is deeply ironic. Okay, so what they welcome him in. Beowulf is going to help us, we hope. And so they have a big dinner, and at that dinner, Hrothgar's chief counselor, a man named Unferth, begins to speak. Now, another one of these Germanic customs that I find delightful was that of insulting each other. I think there's an insult match between Loki and Thor in one of the Norse poems about the gods, right? You deliberately try to egg somebody on to violence. You try to get the better of them. And Unferth, this counselor, says, "You know what, Beowulf? You're going to take on Grendel. I don't think you're going to. I don't think you're going to do any good here. I really don't. I heard you had a swimming match with Brecca, You were a bunch of, you're a couple of idiots doing that, trying to swim across the Baltic Sea. Brecka beat you in that swimming match. He was stronger than you. That's why I think, I don't think you're going to be a match for Grendel. And uh, at this point, everybody in the poet's audience would expect something, right? You either are going to have Beowulf answer Unferth and diffuse the situation wisely, or you have eruption into violence. The bench is clear, you have a brawl on the baseball field. Okay, what's going to happen? Beowulf diffuses the situation, and then he does something surprising. He says, Unferth, you've been drinking a whole lot of beer, my friend. Perhaps too much beer has gotten to your head because you've not spoken correctly about the swimming match. Let me tell you, Brecka and I, we were just a couple of boys. Boys are brainless. We decided we would have this swimming match across the ocean there, across the sea. We would be wearing our we were wearing our armor and we had our swords with us and we're swimming. Brecka could not swim past me, and I would not swim past him. Okay. Then there was this great big storm and we got separated. Brecka, he washed up in Finland. As for me, I got attacked by sea monsters. I killed them. They didn't swim very fast after I got to them, right? And that's how it happens. That's how it happened. I survived those clutches and lived. The sea bore me, the ocean's current, lifting walls of water to the land of the Lapps. So Finn ended up east, I ended up west and north. I have never heard of a harder night fight under heaven's vault, or a man more oppressed on the ocean's streams. And now he turns the tables on Unferth. Never in the din and play of battle did Brecka or you show such courage, not to boast about it. Though you were a manslayer, that thu dinum brotherum tobanan warda, though you became a bane to your own brothers, for which you are going to suffer, clever as you are. In other words, Hrothgar has as his chief counselor a fratricide, a man who has killed his brothers. That's just, we don't think, well, Hrothgar is a bad man. Hrothgar is a very good man in this culture, very good. We evaluate him as very good, but also he is a man of this place and a man of that way of life. Is by no means odd that he should have such a person at his right hand as Unferth. In other words, the problems that beset our heroes in the poem Beowulf, to a lesser extent Hrothgar, these are problems that are both inside them and outside, right? We can view them as the three great monsters that Beowulf has to defeat in the poem. Grendel, Mrs. Grendel, that is Grendel's mother, and then the dragon at the end, right? They're exterior to us. But the great thing about the poem is that the poet shows us that these monsters are all interior also, and not just interior in a person, in the heart and soul. They're interior to the very Germanic culture that is being treated of here, treated of in a frank, brutally honest, but not contemptuous way. Okay. The enemy is not out there in the moors. That creature out there on the moors is just the right monster for us because of what we are. And there's no way that we can use our own monstrous ways to defeat that monster. I give you an example of this before I actually get to Grendel and Beowulf's fight, right? So this is considerably later in the poem. Beowulf has in fact killed Grendel, and then has killed Mrs. Grendel, his mother, and he has gone back to his own country with all kinds of accolades, with gifts from Rothgar, who says goodbye to him and fears that he will never see him again. And Beowulf is now back. He's talking to his lord Higelac. And remember, Higelac is a historical figure. He's an actual figure, okay? He will, in his desire to be a good king, lead his men on a disastrous Frisian raid, get himself killed, and there'll be all kinds of trouble, right? So Beowulf comes back and he gives Higelac a rundown of what he did at Hrothgar's place, and he mentions something, and this is really clever of the poet. He mentions that Hrothgar has a daughter that he's going to use. This is another way of trying to deal with the endless hatreds and vengeance takings that characterize this unregenerate human life, right? He's going to give his daughter in marriage in order to bring together peoples, okay? In fact, one of the poetic epithets that's used of women is that they are peace weavers. Namely, you have a daughter, you have a son, okay, the Hatfields and the McCoys, as we try to get ourselves together, when we marry, use a marriage and make us kinsmen by marriage at least, right? To settle this thing, right? And says Beowulf now to Higelac, the shielding king, that is Hrothgar, has brought this about. The guard of his kingdom accepts the opinion that with the young woman he'll settle his share of the killings and feud. But Beowulf has seen too much of the world even now. He's just a young man. He's seen too much to be fooled by this. He knows it doesn't really work. And then he gives us an imagined scene. He says to Higelac, this is the sort of thing that will certainly happen, right? It'll be the wedding. It'll be the great big wedding celebration. And the Danes will be there and they'll be wearing their heirlooms. And what are their heirlooms? Their heirlooms are belts and helmets and swords and knives and things that they've gotten from their fathers or their uncles, because they got them by taking them from some other people in war, right? So then they're all there swanking around with their heirlooms that originally belonged to somebody else. And there'll be some old fellow, says Beowulf to Higelac, some old fellow will be at that feast. And he'll come up, and we recognize that this is satanic, okay? We recognize it. He'll say, hey, kid, right? I'm being very loose here. Hey, kid, yeah, look, you see that sword over there? That's the sword that your father wore. He carried that sword in the last battle he ever fought. He died. That was his sword when the Danes killed him. How about that? Yeah. Now, some son or other of your father's killers walks in this hall. Yeah? There it is in his pride. He's carrying that treasure that's rightfully yours. Enough said. Beowulf says he keeps doing this with his words. He sharpens the man's mind, the boy's mind. He whets him on till one day there's that retainer of the Danes hacked to death, and the sword taken. And then boom, all at once. Where's your peace? Okay. Where is it? Where's it gone? Right? Forget about it, right? This is one case. There are others in the poem, right? What you try to do with marriage or with payoffs or with truces and some combination of those payoffs, marriages. You try to settle the tremendous passions of fallen man. And it doesn't work. At best, it's a Band-Aid on a severed artery. Um, it the same people who are attempting to bring about peace are the ones who are afflicted with the disease right to the core. Um, it's a contradiction in terms. Okay, we kind of see this this inability of the culture to come to grips with its own interior contradictions, its interior failings. Um, with Grendel himself. Okay, Grendel is a monster who, when he sees the happiness, the joy of the men inside Hrothgar's new hall, Heorot is the name of that hall. Um, he he can't stand it anymore. Okay, he's he's not part of it, and yet he is part of it, right? He's sort he thinks he should be there, but he is not there, right? He comes over the moors and he waits until it's nighttime, and then he engages uh, in this unbanquet, this feast of bloodshed. Um, he comes back in the night. He is not permitted by God to come back during the day, so he is both in Heorot and not in Heorot. Um, he characterizes Heorot in a way that the people themselves can't even recognize, but I think we're supposed to recognize. Okay, um, and when Beowulf finally fights him, right, the young Beowulf comes. The Danes can't beat him. Okay, I mean, it's interesting. No historical figure in the poem is set against Grendel or Grendel's mother, right? It requires a figure that is somehow strangely in that world, but not completely in that world. Um, it requires a figure like Beowulf, uh, and yet even Beowulf is more like Grendel. And the critics, even the critics that Tolkien went after, they did kind of recognize this. That Beowulf, the poet, has cast Beowulf in such a way that it's inevitable that we compare Beowulf with Grendel. Okay, he wants us to. Here comes Grendel. Beowulf is with his men, his thanes. Um, they are in the great hall of Heorot. It's nighttime. They're sleeping, and Grendel arrives. Um, Beowulf is the only one awake, and he watches. Interesting. I mean, he has to use some strategy here. He is willing to sacrifice the life of one of his men to get a kind of advantage on Grendel. Grendel comes in, bursts the door open, and laughs in his heart because he sees all these sleeping figures. It'll be the last time he ever laughs. I read it to you in Old English, and I'll tell you what it means. That's Aglek Uldentochter. It wasn't that the monster decided to dally there. But he seized right away. First opportunity, slap a wrench, a sleeping warrior. Slot unwerdum. He slit him on a wings, bonlocken, bit through the bone locks. Blood edrum drank the blood from the veins. Sunsnadum swach. Swallowed him up in gobbets. Sona had the unliviness, salia farmwood, fate and forma. A lovely Germanic understatement. Right away, he had feasted all upon the guy who was no longer alive. The Unlivian is the guy who's no longer alive, feet and hands. And then he steps up to Beowulf, and Beowulf sees, okay, I don't know what this monster is about. And Beowulf gets Grendel in a wrestling hold. And the grammar in the fight sometimes makes it unclear who is the monster and who is the man. And that's deliberate on the part of the poet. It's It's deliberate on the part of the poet that Beowulf is unable to kill Grendel in Heorot. He tears off his arm. It's a relic, okay? And Grendel flees to the moor and he dies at the bottom of that lake where his mother lives, right? The cleansing does not come about in Heorot itself. It can't, because Heorot is like Grendel and Grendel's lair, okay? When Beowulf goes down to the bottom of that lake to defeat Grendel's mother, we don't even know exists until she comes. She's only behaving as a good Germanic monster should. You killed my son, I got to kill one of you. She comes raiding the next night, and Hrothgar, he took my best friend. She took my best friend, my best advisor. There's no replacing him. They track her down to the swamp. While they're tracking her down, they see, and it's a terrible thing to see, right up on the top of a tree, right in everybody's sight. What a sad thing. Asher's head, the head of the advisor. Grendel's mother too is not killed in the public place, is killed in this mysterious place at the bottom of the lake. It's if there's always something missing, something wrong with the vengeance taken. There's no end to it. Vengeance and then greed. Okay. This is what the society is built upon too, right? So we get the kind of hot monsters in the first 2/3 of the poem. We get the cold monster later on. What's fascinating here is that well, so much is that Beowulf has been told by Rothgar, you would make a very good king of your people. But when Beowulf, as a good loyal thane, accompanies his lord Helak on this disaster, right? They had no business being there. Beowulf avenges Helak's death, and then Helak's widow offers him the throne, and anybody else would have taken it, but Beowulf declines in favor of his lord's son, who's just a boy still. And only when that boy is killed does Beowulf assume the throne, and he mainly rules by keeping all the people who hate the Geats at bay. All right, he rules them for 50 years until the dragon comes, and the dragon is this monster emblematic of the greed at the heart of this way of life too. And again, I don't think the poet is saying, what, the German way of life here, boy, it was particularly horrible. You really should go someplace else. What he's saying is, this is mankind. This is unredeemed mankind. Okay, we don't have. This is just a Germanic form that it takes. Change things around a little bit, and this could be Rome. Change it around a little bit, it could be Athens. Okay, this is man, right? Man unredeemed. Beowulf is as good a person, as good a king as this system can make. And it's fascinating is he's not the historical figure. So it's as if we had to turn to historical figures alone, we wouldn't get somebody as good as Beowulf. But he rules for 50 years mainly by being so strong that people leave him alone and leave his people alone. But when the dragon starts to rampage around the countryside in hatred and greed because somebody, an unknown slave, stumbled upon his barrow and stole one cup, a gold cup, to kind of buy his way back into his master's good graces. And the dragon misses the one cup. Dragon sleeps on this treasure, doesn't do him a bit of good. Poet says he's not one bit the better off for it, right? He misses the one cup, it enrages him, and he goes burning and destroying through the countryside. And Beowulf, as the good king, decides he has to deal with his dragon, okay? From the dragon, he gets his mortal wound, as I said, just as he, with the help of his only loyal retainer, Wiglaf, all the others run away, okay? he and Wiglaf together managed to kill the dragon. And one of the last things that Beowulf asks from his friend and his young friend and warrior, bring to me, so I can see before I die, bring to me the treasure, right? That they're going to distribute, you'll distribute it then to the people. Bring to me the treasure that I won for my people. And he looks upon it all and he dies. And that treasure, so the treasure, the poet says of the treasure and the dragon was not one bit better off for the treasure. Well, it turns out that the Geats are not going to be one bit better off for the treasure either, because the people are so appalled by what has happened. They load up the pyre with all of that treasure and they destroy it. It doesn't do them any bit of good. Wiglaf himself, the one loyal one, okay? You think of the apostles all running away, except for the young apostle John at the crucifixion of Christ. Wiglaf, now he looks upon those who had sworn loyalty, right? And they ran away. And he says, this is not going to go unnoticed. We don't have our king anymore. And your cowardice will be talked about. Now the Swedes are coming, okay? The Swedes have been enemies of the Geats for a couple of generations. Why? Kings killing other kings, and the actual historical events that we're talking about there, right? Well, there'll be no way to keep the Swedes off us now. Now we're in for it, okay? Forget it. We're in big trouble because the Swedes will come avenging, right? They've been kept at bay for 50 years, but not anymore. They're coming, all right? That's the prediction. So in other words, it's not just at the end of the poem, the end of an enigmatic, in some ways profoundly good, but in other ways quite limited by his own culture, this figure Beowulf. It's what we really got predicted is the end of the Geats as a people, and perhaps the poet suggesting this is as far as that way of life, the way of life of my own forebears, this is as far as it could go. It can't go any farther. It has hit the wall. It has hit the impasse. And now it's time for Wiglaf. The name means the one left over from battle, the survivor, to hear of a different way of life entirely, to hear of a remedy for the evils that the society itself could not remedy because they were inherent to it. And now I think it's time for some questions or comments or something from any of you.
So thank you so much, Dr. Esolen. That was incredible. I was quite spellbound. So thank you so much for presenting to us. So a couple of the questions that we have are in regards to translation. So
right.
I assume many of the students are like me and we do not read or speak Old English at all. Thankfully, Shakespeare isn't in Old English because none of us would be able to understand that.
Right.
So they were wondering what the best translation is, and then what's the worst translation?
Oh, well, I don't know about the worst. Well, I'll tell you what, though. I have two translations that I do go to, okay? One of them is by an old professor from Amherst College called Hal Chickering. And what's nice about this translation, he tries to be as literal as possible. He doesn't pretend to be a poet. What you do have, though, is the Anglo-Saxon on the left-hand side with line numbers and a corresponding line-by-line, roughly line-by-line translation of it on the right-hand side. And quite a lot of discussion about everything you would want to know about the poem from the point of view of that particular critic, okay? Some of it I disagree with, some of it I think is really good. and he gives genealogies and so forth. So this is a very useful book. Okay. I have used with my own students this edition by the Presbyterian minister Douglas Wilson. It is not facing page, so it's all a translation. It tries to be as literal as possible. The translation is quite readable, and the essay at the end is great. Okay, and in fact, I'm developing dependent upon some of it, Wilson's insights. And I know that everybody loves the Seamus Haney translation, and I think that if Seamus Haney is your deal, then by all means read Seamus Haney. You might get a little bit more of Haney and a little bit less of the Beowulf poet. It depends upon what you want to read it for. If you want to read it to find out really as precisely as you can without reading Old English, what was the poet saying exactly, then I would not go there. Okay, but if you want a great experience reading the poem in some fashion or other, then of course Haney is a great poet, and these guys don't pretend to be great poets, but that's not what they're doing. I would stay away from the translation by Burton Raffle. Somebody said which is the worst, and not that it's bad translation, but Raffle doesn't at all get the delicious ironic understatements. Instead of saying what the poet might say with tongue in cheek, the equivalent of that was not a good day for Grendel. Okay, Raffle will translate that was a terrible day for Grendel, and it's, shall we say, it's not the same.
Well, that's wonderful. I have some new translations to add to my list because the only one I'd really read was Seamus Haney.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to do that.
Okay, good.
Then we have another question from Kelly who asks, Dr. Esolen, you mentioned a relic. Did the Germanic pagans have relics?
Oh, well, not in the Christian sense, but see, all people, maybe until our own time, we're the weirdos in this case, right? But all people have kept keepsakes, right? I mean, think that the ancient Romans, if you couldn't afford it, you had a little figurine. But if you could afford it, you'd get, when Uncle Vito died, you'd put plaster on his face, right? You make a plaster mask of his face at death. And from that mask, you get a sculptor to sculpt the bust of Uncle Vito. And that bust will be on your hearth, on the mantle, or it'll be taken out of a special chest and put on the mantle during holy days, okay? That's a veneration of your ancestors that we no longer, I think, we find it very, very hard to understand. In this world here, in this Germanic world, every object of any importance has a story to it. Swords even have names half the time. And this is the bracelet that was made by the blacksmith god Wayland, and it was given to so and so until he was defeated in battle, and then somebody else took it and gave it to his wife, and so on, right? I mean, these things are preserved, these things are kept, just as memories of these events are kept in poetic form. One of the famous battles that's given a kind of a real swift treatment, it's like talking about the Civil War, if you had to describe the Civil War in 40 lines. In the Beowulf poem, we had the poem, we didn't realize that actually happened, then we finally got the archaeology of it, and they discovered, in fact, the site of the battle, and that battle had taken place about 400 years before the events of this poem, which are already about 100 years old, more than 100 years old. All right, Hela dies in the 521. The poem is written about maybe year 700 or so, but for about 400 years, more. The events of that battle are remembered by the people in poetry. And the Beowulf poet, puts them together and puts them in his own poem. So they did have relics of saints, but they had relics, sort of, kind of, yeah.
So could it be sort of like, I know some families pass down a wedding ring or an engagement ring. Can we think of
Oh
it
yeah,
like that?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So
Except that the ring in question was probably gotten after you killed somebody,
took it off the finger.
or you stole it from someone, right? Yeah.
So it's sentimental, but not in the way we would think of it as being sentimental.
Oh, really powerfully sentimental, right? With enough passion in it to make you want to kill somebody to get it back.
Yes, yes. So we have another question from Skylar, who's
Okay.
saying, do you think that the change the poet wanted to see at the end of the poem came to fruition? Or did the corruption and greed go on it in the same sort of scale as it was described in the poem?
Human beings are what they are. And we're not going to get past that. And certainly the evangelization of German tribes did not make them into saints, all of them. But it made some of them into saints. And it did change. It did begin like leaven in the dough. It began to work its work. Um, Certainly there were things in newly Christian England, or where the Saxons, the Angles were. There were things that their own grandparents or great grandparents could never have imagined. Right. There's it's hard for us nowadays to talk about it because we're taught to scorn everything that religious faith brings, and to shrug and say, oh well, it didn't change a thing. That's not true. But human beings are what they are, and they're creatures of habit, and these habits of a culture, they're centuries and centuries old. We shouldn't expect that they would disappear overnight. They didn't, but they were changed, and they were redirected, and then some things were really quite new. So I hope that helps to answer Skylar's question. I think Skylar is a Facebook friend of mine, I'm guessing.
Wonderful. So I actually have a question, and this is
Okay.
something that I've been curious about for a while. So there are a lot of long epic poems that are written in Northern Europe.
Right.
Why is it that Beowulf is the one that's kind of stuck with us and that we don't read like the Icelandic sagas? Is it because of language, or is there really like a content difference that sticks with us?
Uh, well, Tolkien, if you had asked him, would be tearing out his hair and saying, "What do you mean we don't read them? Of course we read them. Where you been? We read them. Come to my class." They certainly do still read. I bet you they still read the sagas in Iceland. What they read now in Scandinavia, I have no idea. Whether they've gone all modernist and they are now taught to despise their own culture, I don't know. I sense that some of that is true, that they are taught to despise these things. Beowulf survives to us in a single manuscript. So the real question to ask is, gosh, how lucky are we, right? Suppose we hadn't, we got to figure that we lost most of what was written just from, time, carelessness. Something is misplaced. The library room burns down, right? Um, Imagine how many other great poems there must have been that we don't have. So we're thankful that we do have what we do have, but it's only one manuscript. It's in with other poems. They're Christian poems. Um, that state of affairs continues right through to the invention of the printing press. We just have there's just scads of lost works, and the fact that so many of the greatest works in the Middle Ages we don't know the authorship of, we don't know who wrote them, suggests to me that, you know, maybe we're lucky if we have 5 or 10% of the great works that were actually written. Right? Imagine. You can make yourself world famous if you stumble upon a manuscript someplace lying behind a doorstop in a Swiss monastery.
We can only hope.
Oh yeah. Well, that's what they did in the Renaissance. That's what they started to do in the 1400s. They started to find things. The people combed old monasteries. They literally found things. That's how we got Lucretius's De Rerum Natura. We found a manuscript in a Swiss monastery. A whole lot of stuff from the ancient world we have because somebody found it around 1400 or 1500.
Wonderful. Well, we have a very interesting question from Kelly.
Okay.
Who asks, do we know if the monk who wrote Beowulf was with St. Boniface's group? She said the date would work.
The dates are the dates are intriguing. No, probably not. He's probably later than. Well, now wait a second. I'm not sure. Wait. So Boniface is alive. It's a fascinating question. So Boniface is alive at the time, I believe, of the Battle of Tours, won by Charles Martel against the Muslims in the year 732. I'm sort of placing the Beowulf poet sometime in the early 700s. So I don't think he would have been with Boniface, but their lives overlap. The Beowulf poet is writing from England. This is English. This is not Old Saxon, which would be across the North Sea in what is now Germany. So we got to place him in England, and that would suggest that he's not with Boniface. But there's all the probability in the world that their lives overlap, and they may have, they may have been acquainted with some of the same people. They may have known some of the same people.
Wonderful. Well, I think we are about out of time, but thank you so much, Dr.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Taking the time. This was absolutely wonderful, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of our attendees that this was I think the best use I could think of for a Thursday night,
Okay.
And I learned so much. So thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us. We really appreciate having you, and if you're one of our students who will be taking either the CLT 8 next week or the CLT later in May, best wishes on your exams. You're studying, and I hope you found maybe your next favorite book. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Sarah.